So this is lecture 2. As I mentioned in lecture 1, Cinderella, especially the Grimm's version, I think is the most important fairy tale on the planet because it is so archetypal, appears in so many different cultures. And attachment theorists have made a strong case that love is the most significant human experience. And indeed, it is the course, the core, I think, of all of most psychological systems, maybe all of them, and certainly of all religions. So Cinderella is about being abandoned, unloved, and unlovable, and as a consequence, unable to love. Love cannot be preached into a person. It has to be experienced. Grimm's Cinderella highlights the rather unique Jungian concept in the world of psychology that love can be engendered from the archetypal realm as part of human nature, akin to Lao Tzu's Tao as the source of the 10,000 things. The realm of the mothers, as Jung called it, the deeper levels of the collective unconscious and the functioning of the transcendent function. So I also mentioned in lecture 1 the psychological construct for Cinderella's first mother being a narcissistic parent, where the child is a narcissistic object for the parent. The child does not receive essential mirroring by the parent that experientially establishes a sense of itself. Instead, the child must mirror the parent. It always has to feel what the parent feels by way of mirroring the parent. And I'm working with a client right now with this very problem. I've always had some in my practice through the years, and it is always kind of surprising to me just how deep this wound goes. So from a very early age, the child has mirrored the parent instead of vice versa. So they're always trying to feel what the parent feels, and as a consequence, they don't ever, or they have very little sense of what their feelings are. Excellent little book describing the emotional problems of growing up with a narcissistic parent is Alice Miller's book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. And several of my analyses over the years have found it to be most helpful. And I should mention that I had a client some years ago. I think I only saw her for about 15 sessions, told her about this book very early because I realized it was a similar problem to what Alice Miller described. And most of her therapy was reading that book and reflecting on it and journaling it. That was at least half of our therapeutic work. A YouTube video on the still face experiment by Dr. Edward Tronick illustrates the devastating effect of an infant not being mirrored by the mother. Watch the video if you can. It is absolutely chilling. So I will describe it to you. This is what you see on YouTube. This is the mother in her still face. It started out where the mother was interacting with her baby in this little baby carriage. And the baby would smile and the mother would smile. And the baby would point and the mother would look up there and so on. And then after a while, the mother left the room. And when she came back, she was to have a still face like this. The baby would smile, still face by the mother. Baby would point, mother wouldn't look, still face. And after a rather short period of time, the baby got really upset, started to cry a bit, and couldn't even look at the mother. So the Grimm's brothers promoted families during a turbulent period in European history, a little similar, I suspect, to Confucius during the Warring State period in Chinese history. Some of the original versions of the fairy tales did not have a mother and a stepmother, but the good and bad mother was one person. This is the way many people in therapy have experienced their mother, which makes for a very conflicted relationship. I think the Grimms were collecting their fairy tales in Germany somewhere in 1820s, 1830s. A lot of things, a lot of pressure was building in Europe, and they had a lot of revolutions across the European continent in 1848. After the revolution failed, Many of them fled the country. One of them was Jung's grandfather, Carl Jung, who went to Basel, and that's who Jung was named after. So Jungians have long been dealing with narcissism and deep attachment issues by working with an archetypal and symbolic framework. Narcissism being a big interest in the psychological community some decades ago, with many psychological descriptions from different schools of thought. For in the end, it's what it feels like to live within the diagnoses that are being conveyed in story form, as in Cinderella, and even more purely from a narcissistic viewpoint in the fairy tale Snow White. There, the Queen Mother asked every day, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And then one day, she got an answer from the mirror that said her daughter was more beautiful than her. So the mother immediately started to try to kill her daughter, eventually poisoning her with an apple. That is what it feels like to live with a narcissistic parent, to feel fed poisoned food by the mother. I should make a qualifier here. Better to say the archetypal mothering energy, because you can have a really narcissistic father as well and not receive loving from the father. So it can be poisoned from the father as well. But this would be a good point to mention that our sense of ourselves is best conveyed by a story. We have the story of our lives, and that story can evolve. So that's why these stories like fairy tales and so on are so powerful, because we each have a kind of a running story about who we are within our own psyches. One way you see that, especially if you're working with dreams, is how the dreams turn our daily events or weekly events or important things into a dream story. And then the big dreams put our life story into a more mythic dimension. To me, that's one of the most beautiful things about working with dreams, and why I think Jungian psychology and I think most Jungians still emphasize dream work, is that you can see that somehow or another your life is put into some very different story than your conscious state. But when you work with the dream, you can usually see connections to the conscious state, although sometimes it's really deeper than that in the archetypal. But to me, like I said, that's just one of the beauties of dream work. Coco, I'm so glad you can keep up with me on this. I mean, I prepared all the text before, but as I'm delivering it and then listening to you translate, other thoughts come to mind. So it's a way of me embellishing my own lecture. So back to the prepared text. So up to our point in the fairy tale, Cinderella's in the ashes, and she has endured and not spoken. And Catherine Asper suggests that the stepsister aspect of the Cinderella complex still goes out into society and is not isolated. And parts of her Cinderella still function like a mother who takes care of the family, but is encapsulated and mute within. Cinderella in the ashes also suggests the possibility of Phoenix rising from the ashes, and that is hinted by a change in the storyline, as we will see. It happened that the father was once going to the fair, and he asked the two stepdaughters what he should bring back for them. Beautiful dresses, said one. Pearls and jewels, said the second. And you, Cinderella, said he, what will you have? Father, break off for me the first branch that knocks against your hat on your way home. So he bought beautiful dresses, pearls, and jewels for the two stepdaughters. And on the way home, as he was riding through a green thicket, a hazel twig brushed against him and knocked off his hat. Then he broke off the branch and took it with him. When he reached home, he gave the stepdaughters the things which they had wished for, and to Cinderella he gave the branch from the hazel bush. Cinderella thanked him, went to her mother's grave and planted the branch on it, and wept and prayed. and a little white bird always came on the tree. And if Cinderella expressed a wish, the bird threw down to her what she had wished for. So notice it happened that the father was once going to a fair. Note again how generic and nothing specific for time, space, and event. It happened. The psyche moves on its own accord. A fair or a festival is a gathering of people in an increase in psychic energy, new input from outside sources and expanded horizons, transitions, something special and beyond the daily routines. These are some associations that come to mind, especially for cultures hundreds of years ago in rural areas. So note that it was the father who went to the festival. This is the father in Cinderella's psyche associated with yang energy, and I talked about that last time. That which is more outgoing and in the world, active and spreading out. It's helpful to consider events in dreams and archetypal materials like fairy tales in terms of yin and yang energy and their relationships. I should add that in one of the last courses I had in my training in Zurich, that would have been in 1982, the then president of the institute was giving a course and presented a dream. And as I've mentioned in other courses, and I think in this course too, so much of my symbolic orientation comes from the I Ching. So when he was telling this dream, I was thinking in terms of yin and yang and everything. And when I got done talking, the instructors said, "Thank you, Dennis, for illustrating what is wrong with traditional Jungian psychology." And he thought there was just too much emphasis on symbols and stuff like that. But I still orient that way, and I find it very helpful. You have to, of course, do more than that. But to me, the yin yang symbol and that concept of yin yang energy is at a very fundamental level. As I mentioned last time, I think the I Ching, when Jung got Wilhelm's translation, I think it had a very strong influence on his whole conceptual system. And one of the many I Ching books that I have, the Taoist I Ching, translated by Thomas Cleary, presents all the lines in the I Ching in this manner. Every line he talks about what's happening with the yin and yang energies. This is the only translation I have that does that. After all, half the commentary on the 64 hexagrams concern hexagrams 1 and 2, the creative and the receptive. Creative hexagram 1, of course, being all yang lines, and hexagram 2, all yin lines. So as an aside, I made a case in my major presentation to the C.G. Jung Club of Orange County on the I Ching, Oracle and Book of Wisdom, that the figure in the center of the Taoist row holding up the yin-yang symbol is Hermes in our Western tradition. And that lecture has been translated into Chinese, and I talked to the president of the Orange County Jung Group a couple of weeks ago, and she told me that program is the most widely viewed program that they have put out from their organization. They've had, I think, 1,400 views of it, and I think it's been out there about 2 years now. And the other program that I did, Hexagrams from the I Ching, Appearing in the Dreams of a Western Man, that also has a large number of views. It's the same, basically the same program I gave a couple of years or so ago at the Samplay conference. I think that was in December of 22. So this would be an example of an archetypal image. This would be how it appeared in China. Like I said, but in the West, that same energy was imaged as Hermes, a guy with wings on his helmet, wings on his feet. So the archetypal image is how an archetype per se, or the basic pattern, how that manifests in different cultures and periods of time. But like I said, when I looked at that robe closely, I thought, oh my God, that's Hermes. So the storyline so far has been of a depressed, homeless, hopeless, mute Cinderella stuck in unprocessed grief. As Oscar expressed it, something may now happen because something that has abandoned you until now starts to take you into account. You might start to read books, go into analysis, change jobs. There is an opening to new possibilities because something hooks you, something happens, or you decide you've just had enough of it. The cause can come from the outside, but it needs a psychic side that is open to it. So the movement comes from the father part of this of the Cinderella complex that is associated with decision-making, clarity, perspective to go somewhere and to act. Take a step out to get out of the depression or bottleneck situation. The father energy gives it direction, and the psyche is ready to follow. So two new constellations have emerged in the fairy tale. First, something had to happen, and it does in the form of something done to or coming to the psyche. Second, all of a sudden, a wish emerges. The cure of a neurosis begins when an individual begins to express themselves. A mundane yet perfectly valid stepsister fantasy or wish is to be somebody with prestige and material well-being. This is giving value to oneself and to the rejected part of oneself. A deeper wish is to live, to be one's true self, as symbolized by a wish for greenness, a green twig that can take root and grow. Unless the psyche can have such a wish, not much can be done in therapy. Jungian analysis is not a treatment. It's not something we do to people to make them better. It may help to awaken or constellate a wish by the client to grow, to change. And the analyst must detect the signs that are usually small without killing it with too much conscious light, like that image is the healing potential in you. Just follow it. And this is kind of a frustration that I and many Jungians have when you're working with dreams and see things in an archetypal level. As an analyst, you can get really excited about something that you see because you know kind of how you have a good sense how our dreams work, and you can see that this is a shift. But often the analysan is far from having that feeling about it. So as an analyst, you really have to temper how much of a deal you make of it, because if you get too excited and they can't feel it, you kind of lose the connection with you at the analysan. So in therapy, you try to find a step small enough for the analysan to be able to succeed at doing it, to take the first step toward change as described in a line in the I Ching, and I couldn't find it, about the longest journey beginning with the first step. This is related to the concept of sensitive dependence on initial conditions in the mathematics of complexity theory. So Osborne noted that, like the positive father energy, therapists must relate to and accept both sides, both aspects of the psyche's wishes in a non-judgmental way. A wish for social status often precedes the wish for the green twig of potentially deep soul involvement. As humans, we have an eternal side, and we must live in the world. Certain people need their diplomas and worldly things to survive. So Cinderella's request is most unusual. Imagine asking your father for whatever brushes his hat off. It's like at some deep level, the psyche knows that her problem is the worldview represented by her father that must be disrupted for something new to develop. In English, we have a saying, what hat do you wear? So hats are associated with particular professions, occupations, levels of power and prestige. A baker's hat, a judge's wig, a bishop's mitre. Hats symbolize collective value systems, personal value systems, and the social status of a person. We could also say, what uniform do you wear? What executive case do you carry? What ID cards do you have in your wallet or purse? Another form of a hat is having a list of so many things to do and responsibilities to meet that it leaves little space for development. So people can hide a lot of things under their hats, their personas. It can be hard to relate to a feeling side of a person too identified with their persona. The hat must be knocked off or knocked about before something else can get in. As Leonard Cohen saying, that's how the light gets in. This is what you see on the screen is a stanza from one of his songs. Cinderella is hoping for an accident, a synchronicity, the intervention of the gods, if you will, to disrupt a worldview and a collective attitude. To reiterate what I mentioned before, at the deepest level, one can see this fairy tale as a story about a profound shift in an archetype defined as a historical dominant, like being in the so-called patriarchy, not only in the West. Yeah, that's an important aspect of the archetype, an archetype as a historical dominant, like some thought or some image. For the West, for example, the image of Christ on the cross that has influenced Western culture for like 2,000 years. That's a historical dominant. A crack in that Christian Western dominant was Nietzsche. Jung was very influenced by Nietzsche, who said, God is dead. So Jung said a paradigm shift had to come to the West and countries affected by the West. That now includes pretty much the whole world. He called that a new age or the age of Aquarius. And one attribute of the new age would be a rise in archetypal feminine energy. And that's what the Cinderella is about at an important level. It is not connected to the, if not connected to the unconscious as the irrational source to the new, the Tao as the mother, as Lao Tzu described, the source of the 10,000 things, and the unconscious support for what emerges from the unconscious, a person, any culture will resort to the more readily available collective values, opinions, and attitudes. You go back to this one and make another comment. One of the other attributes Jung saw in the New Age would be a rise of different spiritual forms. There are many young people, I think about 25 to maybe 30% of young people in America don't identify with any faith. And one thing that we saw happening in the 1960s was a lot of religions coming in from the East, from India especially, but also that's when a big interest began with the I Ching. And in 1975 is when I got introduced to the I Ching. But this is all part of the crack in the Christian facade, if you will. I don't see the I Ching as being a spiritual system per se. I think the wisdom in the Jing is so profound and so basic that I would think that the spiritual traditions of any culture could incorporate it. It does not refer a lot to any particular spirituality, if you will. But like I said, I think because it is just such an archetypally fundamental book that it has universal application, universal interest. I went into detail about that in my Orange County lecture on the I Ching. So the father's hat got knocked off by a hazel twig when he was riding through a green thicket. So in my article on dream interpretation that I think you all have, I mentioned the concept of every element in a dream being like a disco ball. That's a ball with all these mirrors on the surface of it, being like a disco ball. And you have to choose the particular associations for each disco ball that will contribute to an emerging storyline, metaphorically, that being the string that ties all of the disco balls together to make a bracelet. So if you think of it like with a dream, you have all these, say, have many different elements in the dream, and you do your personal associations and get your archetypal associations and so on. And then what you got to do is you got to play around with that and see what kind of a story begins to emerge. And then you see that what elements, you begin to see what elements in the individual, what aspects of the individual elements fit into the storyline. And then what you usually see is that some new associations starts to emerge. And it's often at that point, those deeper associations come to the fore. But you've got to play around with it. The way I describe it is like, for those of you that ever made bread, and I used to watch my mother make bread, you have flour and then you put some milk in there and so on. And then you got to keep kneading it, and it'll be lumpy, but you keep kneading it, and eventually it's smooth. And that's how I kind of imagine, if you imagine all those little lumps by being like associations that you don't know if they fit or not, you keep working until you find all the associations that fit together to make a storyline. And this is a very interactive process between the analyst and the analysand. There has to be a trust there, and the analysand has to be trusting and open enough to give associations. If you don't get associations and cooperation from the analysand's end, you can't get anywhere with dream interpretation, except some dreams are so archetypal that you really don't need any interpretation, but most of the time you're not working in that archetypal dimension so clearly, so purely. And I mentioned in the dream interpretation article, I've been working with dreams as an analyst now for 40 years. And I would say 30–40% of the time, when I first hear a dream read to me, I have no idea what it's about. The thing is, though, after you've been working with dreams long enough, you don't panic. When you hear a dream, you don't have a clue, because your experience becomes that if you get in there, work with it, if you have give and take with the analysand, you're almost always going to find some meaning coming out of the dream.
Sorry, Dennis, I need to clarify. You mean that we do need the assistant, a cooperation from the client to know the meaning of the dream, right?
With the rare exception of some dreams are just so purely symbolic. I think of those kind of dreams. There are those kind of dreams that if I tell it to, shall I say, a Zurich trained analyst or a Jungian that really has that symbolic sense, there's no interpretation needed. It's just so straightforward. But those dreams are pretty rare. To me, that's the most beautiful thing about being a Jungian analyst, is somebody has put a dream out there. Dreams are so personal, so deep, so intimate, and they're trusting you to handle it with care and in an intimate way. And it's that playful engaging and that back and forth and working with their dream to get some sense of what it means to them. It's not like the analyst is laying an interpretation on the person. It's very much that emerges as the work between two people. To me, that's just beautiful. I think when you work with a good percentage of the clients, pretty high percentage of the clients, particularly if you're a Jungian analyst, and you get dream work going, I think it's the most powerful, and if you want to think in terms of efficiency, efficient forms of therapy. And as I said, working with fairy tales has been the best way for me to develop, and most people, I think, an archetypal and symbolic perspective. So let's get back to the fairy tale. We're picking out that part now from that paragraph. As father was riding through a green thicket. All right, so number symbolism is very important. So what about green? It's associated with regeneration, growth, and potential life. In the West, we have association with the Pentecost, and that was the infusion of Jesus' apostles by the Holy Spirit. The color of the heart chakra in the Indian chakra system. In the Lusher color test, it is associated with self-assertion. Bruce says it's the color that leads to the self. Could be associated with spring as the first of the 4 phases in any cycle of change described in the I Ching: spring, growth, harvest, and trial. And I had illustrated those 4 cycles in my video, Seasons of the Soul, that's been translated into Chinese. And von Franz said is the first color after a depression. So here's another disco ball. The father was going through a green thicket. So the De Vries Symbol Dictionary describes the thicket as the place where the heart hides or is caught. And the heart, H-A-R-T, is an adult male deer, and it's associated with the morning star Venus and resurrection, shedding its hide hair and horns before regrowing them in the West has typified Christ's resurrection. So if you think of what I just read from the De Vries Symbol Dictionary, these are the symbols, the archetypal images from the West, especially Northern Europe, but there would be some different symbols of different animals from China. So that's where you would want to fill that archetypal story in from your Chinese perspective. So what you would be looking for is the kind of the metaphoric base, and the way I describe it with the I Ching, the first part of Wilhelm, he says what the oldest level of the Chinese text is, and then he describes what it means. For example, let his magic tortoise go. But then in the last part of Wilhelm, he describes, based on the structure of the hexagrams and the relationship of the lines, what the deeper metaphoric base is. So that I think as the most fundamental level, that structural analysis of the Jing. But to put it into words and the cultural context, that's where you get into particular images or things like letting a magic tortoise go. The heart is also sacred to Artemis in Greek mythology. She's the goddess of childbirth and symbolic of new beginnings. And you can see with these associations how nature and the human gods and goddesses got intertwined in our Western mythology. Apollo is in the West like the god of science, or first moonshot space program was the Apollo space program. Now, these many years later, we're trying to go back to the moon, and we're calling it the Artemis program. Artemis was the sister of Apollo. So remember, Cinderella asked for a branch from whatever knocked her father's hat off, and a branch is in Latin called pars pro toto, a part representing the whole. So the many associations to hazel in the 2 symbol dictionaries are used are its association to the great goddess in Celtic mythology, associations to love and fertility, and a counter charm against wishes or to attract witches. So one way we're talking about this fairy tale is like Cinderella has this witch inside of her that's poisoning her, that's calling her ugly, clumsy, stupid, and so on. And that one of the dimensions we're looking at is that results from a lack of love and feeling loved. So here we have association with hazel as something to deal with witches, and also associated with love. Notice how these associations are describing a subtle turning point in the fairy tale, a storyline of moving towards something new. Cinderella plants the hazel twig on her mother's grave, and the water from her tears cause it to grow into a beautiful tree. In psychological terms, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who has written extensively on death and dying, says tears come with this acceptance of death, which can be very repressed. Often if the grief is shared, the witch is not projected. Spitz notes that a baby stops crying if no one comes, and people with an abandonment complex hardly ever grieve about themselves. So what is happening here, as Osper points out, is that Cinderella is working through biographical issues by going back to where she had buried too much, where her psyche got stuck and frosted over by the grief when her mother was buried, and so was Cinderella's aliveness. This can happen from a unique crisis with bereavement or a difficult period in one's life. Osper emphasizes not to force to go back to the grave too early. The therapist must have a feel that there are signs that the psyche wants to live. Signs like dream images, what the client says, their fantasies, body gestures, and their vitality. It may be necessary to go through a stage of absolute darkness without perspective for the wish for life to grow in an encapsulated state, removed from the world, for a seedling for life and development to emerge. While enduring a series of catastrophes and hardships from without, a green twig may start to grow within. 3 is a dynamic number, and going to the grave 3 times a day indicates an ongoing process that one has to repeat and be faithful to. Asper cautions not to put all your energy into the process. You have to also function in life. In the modern fast-paced world of jobs, fast-paced world or jobs making great demands on one, or with responsibilities for many people, it can be hard to find the time to grieve. Vital though grieving time is. So a tree is an excellent self-symbol. It's rooted in the earth, which would be like country, family, ancestors, biography. It grows slowly but surely, is strong and endures, and it extends from the ground, which could be the unconscious, to the human domain, like the trunk, and into the spiritual and heavenly domains, the crown. And we never know what new branches and new fruits will emerge from the crown on our tree of life. So growing out of the mother's grave with Cinderella's tears would be the development of new and uniquely her own type of mothering energy. This is related to what Jung called our human nature and the Taoist philosophy rooted in the primal and wondrous presence of the earth's mysterious generative force, as the Great Mother, as Lao Tzu called it. She continuously gives birth to all creation and takes life and regenerates it in an unending cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The death and breaking down of the building blocks of the death and breaking down breaks it back down to the building blocks of psychic energy that can be then reformed into new, more life-enhancing forms. Now, there's a very important concept here in relation to object relations theory from a Jungian perspective. The significant major new self-image emerged from within by process of nature, the natural process of the transcendent function. And it was not an introject from the outside, as object relations people talk about it. Hermes' domain is linking and translating, in this case, one psychological system to another, archetypal psychology to developmental psychology, and the archetypal to the personal. A very respected university professor told me a major problem with Jung and academia is that academics, by and large, have no sense of the symbolic. Now, when a tree symbolically grows in the psyche, Osper noted that people usually have more strength, feel more grounded, have more faith, more trust, are more rooted, have more plans for the future, more vitality, more joy of life. Cinderella is now rooted in the earth and reality, evolving beyond the spiritualized, pious, and idealized mother looking down on her from heaven. So the little white bird that always came on the tree must be considered to be part of the gestalt of the bird and tree, the bird associated with the tree as a self symbol. So birds are associated with fantasies, dreams, and hope, intuition, and white with peace and the Holy Ghost, the activating Spirit of God in the Holy Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. In other words, getting in touch with the self enables one to begin to imagine, dream, and have hope. So the mute, brutalized, depressed Cinderella in the ashes had no wishes for anything. Her wish to live was the first wish emerging from the depression, the wish for a branch that knocked off her father's hat. With the bird, she found the capacity to have wishes. And Osper says, in your fantasy, these wishes are always fulfilled because you travel in them, end of quote. Fantasies about better things in life, relationships, jobs, and so on are not unimportant. One can now relate to and be fed by dream messages from the unconscious, which is cut off during a severe depression. So it's important for the therapist to feel, acknowledge, and witness when the person is ready for dream work, when they have tapped into the realm of the mothers, the Tao, the source that is deeper than the personal mother. Now, one way you can think about this, if you can imagine something that was pretty negative, was there for a long time, it's going to take a while for that to just die off and decompose. So the person may have to be in quite a depressed state for a while for that complete death of the old to occur. So if you try to kind of bring them out of or push them out of the depression too soon, it may not finish off the old forms, if you will. One thing I love about the Ching is that concept of spring, growth, harvest, and trial, that there are 4 phases in any cycle of change. And you can relate that to the seasons, especially here in the upper Midwest. That's on that video, Seasons of Soul, I did. So you have to have a long, cold weather to like kill off insect pests and so on. So if it's with climate change, we're getting a lot of pests now coming up from the south. So our winters are not long enough to kill off those old deadly forms, the insect pest, metaphorically speaking. So Walt Disney's popularized version of the Frenchman Perrault's telling of the tale had a godmother advisor and a gift giver. Grimm's is closer to the indigenous and eco-psychological sense of the sacred in nature. In this way, legends and fairy tales complement the dominant cultural motifs, that being Christianity in the West. Jung described dreams as originating from nature within, and Jung believed modern culture has deviated far from our natural base. So I will repeat what I think is this very important point, especially to a Chinese audience. In this sense about nature and dreams coming out of our basic nature, Jung is close to David Hinton's description of the Tao as, and I've said this before, a cosmology rooted in the most primal and wondrous presence, Earth's mysterious generative power, as seen in Lao Tzu's recurring reference to the female principle as mother, feminine, yielding, source, origin, etc. What we have here is out of the dead body, if you will, of the old mothering energy that got sick and died under the wealth in the yang realm, if you will. Cinderella is bringing forth a new form of feminine energy, mothering energy, and so on, out of nature itself, back to the source. So you can think of things that might get too far from nature, especially easy to happen, like in the corporate system where the ultimate value is money, and there is little or no regard for the environment and often not for the people in the system. Those are human created systems that can be far from nature and yin yang and balance and that sort of thing. So to put that in the context of our story, like the corporate system, corporate model, various stratifications in culture, that would be like the hat that Cinderella's father had on.
Sorry, Dennis, the corporate, right? You mean the first word?
The corporation.
Uh-huh.
The economic model that in so many ways is now international, the idea of the corporation, which is in its purest sense is there to make money. You know, doesn't care about the environment, doesn't care much about people, make money. Think of that as a hat that's dominating a good most of the developed world. And at the deepest archetypal sense of what I think this fairy tale is about, is that hat is about the old paradigms that Jung was talking about. When he said there had to be a paradigm shift. Paradigm means there's a change in all systems, economic, social, spiritual, and so on. And that paradigm shift, he labeled the new age an age of Aquarius. So the old hat has to be knocked off, and that's what Nietzsche talked about, God is dead, all that sort of stuff, all that disruption in the 60s and so on, that there's a tremendous shakeup in the old system. That's that old hat that's being knocked off and broken up. And to reemphasize what I said before, that one of the attributes Jung said would be in the new age, the age of Aquarius, was be a rise in the archetypal feminine energy. So we can take Cinderella as a symbol for the rise of that energy at one level. So my last paragraph here, Cinderella has taken a big step forward in asserting herself, now far beyond a humble request for a twig. The movement of the self, the synchronicity of the hazel twig that accidentally knocked off her father's hat, has developed into a tree as self-symbol through Cinderella's tears and focus into a sense of I am, I exist, and self-validation. The bird threw down to her what she wished for. But I did describe this course as a way of also working with dreams to illustrate how working with fairy tales related to dreams. So I did insert a lot of things that weren't in the prepared text.
So there's one question. Just now when we work on the fairy tale, it talk about the synchronicity of the hazel twig that accidentally knock off her father's hat. Mm-hmm. So the question is, and it seems that the emergence it seems it is also doomed to happen, and how to understand the hazel twig appeared at this particular moment, and does it represent the power of nature?
So nice about teaching a course. You get asked questions that you wouldn't think of otherwise, but I immediately had an answer that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't been asked the question. Definitely represents the power of nature. I think it's exactly what Lao Tzu was talking about when you talk about the source out of which existence and non-existence comes and so on. And when you think of synchronicity, it's something outside of space and time. Space and time are relative to the psyche. That's what Jung talked about. So Cinderella, I think of it, or how do I think of it? One way I think of it, and this has been really important for my speculations about this, is when you put a question to the I Ching. It's been my experience since using it since 49 years now, I've been using the I Ching, that it works. So I'm expecting a synchronicity when I ask the Jing a question. Right? There's you put a question to the Jing, totally random process. I'm expecting to get a meaningful answer. Where does that answer come from? Whatever the source is. That source is what has generated everything. And it is, one of the philosophers, I forget his name, but the idea of like a holistic universe, that everything is interconnected. And it's nature in its purest form, if you will. And I think of whatever gives us those answers from the I Ching is also what produces our dreams. So it's a tricky question. She was, and I have to say one more thing about it. It's like the young Indian boys that go on a vision quest, 4 days and nights without food and water on the Great Plains in summer. You feel like you're going to die. You're praying for a vision. You're hoping for a vision. You can't count on it. But Cinderella, in that desperate state, if you will, expressed her first hope. It was like hoping for a vision, hoping for something different. And that hope in this tale got expressed as, if you will, hoping, praying that something's going to knock off what at some deep level, I think the psyche, as she experienced it, knew the problem was in the father's realm. That had to be knocked off. So it's a little bit too pointed or directed in a way in the fairy tale, but these are some of my thoughts about that, how that occurs in life as I've experienced it. I don't know how you're going to translate all that. Whoever asked that question went to the most difficult part of the whole fairy tale, I think, kind of this idea of synchronicity. And while we were talking, I had another thought that came to mind. It's related to, again, the concept of spring, growth, harvest, and trial. So if you fill one of those phases, then something new can happen. So we can think of Cinderella's depressive stage as being the trial, like the long winter. And remember the associations with that green, the green thicket and the heart and all that, all those associations with spring. So the psyche, her experience of that depression, of that phase came to an end. And when something changes archetypally within, that's when the environment often mirrors it on the outside. That's what Jung called synchronicity. So at some level, that's what was happening here. It gets tricky when she asked for whatever knocked off her father's hat. I guess the way I would have to describe that is that at some level, it would be like somebody deeply in touch with their archetypal state and kind of knowing that the next phase is coming. And that would have been expressed here as what expecting or anticipating or hoping for something that'll knock off the father's hat. It's a very complex question, I think. And the last thing I'll say about that, I think a significant part of the answer to that, you would have to read Jung's introduction to the English translation of Wilhelm's I Ching, where he tried to explain the difference between the Chinese worldview and the Western worldview.
Dennis, I think the students comment that this presentation is very meaningful and profound. Today is the Women's Day internationally.
Oh,
it's a big day. Yeah.
All right. Perfect.
And, you share with us a deeper understanding of the women development comment by Angela.
Universal Archetypal.
对。
National Women's Day. There we go.
So, from the alchemy perspective, if the part we work on lots of time is the nigredo stage, and what the stage is corresponding to from today's presentation or today's story.
Yeah, the most of the Negredo, she's still in the Negredo, but I talked about last week when she was in the ashes. That was like pure Negredo. Now she's starting to come out of it. This is the greening part of it. We'll get to the albedo when she goes to the balls, but this we're getting some albedo energy here with the wishes, just being able to express wishes. So this is just moving. This is springtime. That's a transition from the Negredo. You can think of winter in some ways as Negredo to we're moving toward the albedo, I think.
So the last question, today is the Women's Day. We really would like to know, and as a women, how to develop our own archetypal feminine energy in our real life, in everyday life.
Yeah. Well, I was there at the beginning of the women's movement. I was in Berkeley graduate school in the late 60s. And what happened, this is how I, as a man, experienced it. But there was a lot of anger on the women's part, and they got together as women just to talk about what it's like to be a woman, what are our problems, and so on. So they had to kind of work that out amongst themselves before they could kind of start coming back and relating to men again. So I think of it like, because of my biological background, I think of how a new species is created. Some population has to be split off from the main part of the population long enough so they can establish a genetic identity. So if and when that population meets up again with the main population, it's not just absorbed back into it. So the way I saw it happening with the women's movement is they had to get out from remove themselves from the so-called patriarchy and just talk amongst themselves about what it is like to be a woman, what are our challenges, our difficulties, and so on. And I think they've done that pretty well here in the West. And the challenge that I'm seeing now mostly is with the young men relating to these so-called liberated women. So the men now don't know, wow, what's our masculine energy now? I think the men have to get together without women around and talk about what do we do with these darn liberated women? And that's what the men's movement was. That's why my next favorite fairy tale is Iron John, because it's about the masculine energy. So a whole movement developed around that fairy tale, another Grimm's fairy tale, to help these young men dealing with these liberated women. And one thing to always keep in mind, of course, is that every culture is going to have a different combination of yin and yang energies. And so that has to be taken into account. So one way might be to look at the yin and yang in every aspect of that culture. So at the broadest sense, for example, what I got a sense, and from my wife particularly, who spent 2 years living in China, I just visited there for probably been in China a total about 5 weeks now. And she said that harmony seems to be a big element in China. That's not a big thing here in the West. It's like every man and woman for themselves, individualism. So you're starting off, if you think of harmony, maybe that's a little more like the feminine energies than individualism, like yang, impulsive. So those are some of the kind of the broader archetypal aspects to consider with regard to that question. And one great example of that we have in the West is at the root of much of our Western culture, of course, is ancient Greece. And the Greeks had a pantheon of the 12 gods and goddesses. So that's a gestalt, an archetypal gestalt, and unique to that culture, that period in time. But if you could if you could put together a pantheon maybe of the Chinese gods or goddesses or whatever thing, and then you could feel kind of the differences in the relationship of masculine and feminine energies, looking at those two cultural systems. But that's part of the power of the Jungian approach, to be able to play at these deep fundamental archetype being like the essence of the gods and goddesses, be like the essence of basic human experiences, how those combinations uh, differ between the cultures is what you're looking for.
Thank you, Dennis. Very
Thank
meaningful
you,
today.
Coco.
Thank you.
I always feel so comfortable working with you. You seem, because I like tonight I had a lot of stuff that wasn't in the script, but you just seem to be able to handle it so well. So Shay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I
好，谢
will
谢
see you
大
next
家，祝
week.
大家节日快乐。Thank you. Happy Women's Day to all
All
of
right.
the audience. Yeah. 谢谢大
Okay.
家。Thank you,
So
Dennis.
long.
Good night. Good night. See you.